Our session this evening is titled The Poetry of Amazement, where we have writer Vikram Chandra, who's going to speak to us about
another battle scene, right? So this is Dvayakshara, a poem, a shloka composed using only 2 consonants. Again, I hope if you've done any kind of writing, you should appreciate the insanity of what this guy's just done, right? He's made not only a sentence, but he's actually made a verse using only 2 consonants. But if you're living in pre-modern India, in one of the richest linguistic philosophical cultures ever, if somebody is going to say, I'm going to write a poem using only 2 consonants, somebody else is going to come along and write an entire shloka using only 1 consonant. Right? So this is from the 14th century, and if you do your Sandhi Viched, you take apart all the compound words, what you end up is with this. Right? And it's a very complex shloka that he's written in his devotion to Vishnu. And he calls himself the lion of poetry and logic, our friend Vedanta Desaika. And based on this one poem, I'm willing to give him that, right? He's certainly a lion of some sort. Ekakshara is very, very difficult to do. In all the anthologies that people have gathered together over the years, we've only found 29 of these, right? And this one is one of the best ones. Now, how is he able to do this? Well, Sanskrit in particular has certain linguistic features that makes it possible to do this kind of poetry. One is that you can make up words, right? So I'm sure maybe there's somebody in this hall whose name is Pankaj. And if you ask Pankaj what his name meant, he'll say lotus. But what he might not know is that Pankaj is actually not a proper noun in the English sense. It's actually a descriptor. Ja is the verb root, which means to generate, to give birth. Panka is mud. So when you put Panka and Ja together, you get Pankaja, born from mud. Therefore lotus. But if you're a poet and Pankaja doesn't fit into your sound scheme, you can take Nadi, river, and push Ja onto it and make Nadija, also lotus. You can take Neer and make Neeraja, also lotus. If you were living in contemporary sort of mixed English times, you could probably make up something like reservoir ja, right? And it would still work, right? So there's a flexibility there that makes it possible to do this kind of thing. So in some of the lexicons, the poetic lexicons from the 2nd millennium, there are many as 110 synonyms for lotus, right? Because people just kept making them up according to the needs of the specific poem that they were working on. Also, word order is pretty loose, right? Unlike English, where you have to put the subject and then the verb, in Sanskrit, you can flip the order and make many different ways of saying the same thing, right? It doesn't matter what the verb is. The verb can be at the beginning of a sentence or at the end of a sentence. So these guys who are working within this intensely difficult form are using all the resources of the language to be able to do this kind of thing, right? But what is also really important to realize here is that who are the people who are able to read this, right? If somebody is making intensely difficult poetry, it means that the audience who's reading this is intensely, enormously sophisticated and educated, right? Okay, so those are some features of Sanskrit. Now there's another feature of Sanskrit that I want to point out to you. I'm going to say a phrase in English, and I want you to listen carefully to it and figure out what I'm saying, okay? Gladly the cross-eyed bear. What did you hear? I'm sure a lot of you heard this. Gladly the cross-eyed bear, right? There's a bear with crossed eyes. But some of you, maybe who were stuck in traffic this afternoon on the way to getting here and are feeling really tired, might have heard this. Gladly the cross-eyed bear, right? So the linguistic construction of these 2 different sentences makes them sound exactly like each other, right? And notice also that in the second sentence, the one with the crucifix, The reason that this ambiguity happens is because I would, when you put I would next to each other, I and would next to each other, it becomes I'd, right? And this happens in other places in English also, right? So it's a Monday, but an egg, right? So certain sounds, when you put them next to each other, they transform the sound. It happens in French often enough that they have a specific word for it. They call it glissance or liaison. And in Sanskrit, those of you who've had a little Sanskrit will know this happens all the time. Any two words or many two words, when you put them next to each other, start to sound the same. Now the question is, in terms of these two English phrases, what did I actually say? Did I say either of these two things? If you want to be pedantic and literal about it, you could argue that I didn't say either of these things. What I actually said was this. And that is American phonetic alphabet, which linguists use to describe sound, just sound. So what came out of my mouth was a continuous stream of phonemes or sounds, and then when you heard it under the surface of your consciousness, a bunch of cognitive processes went to work, and they took that linear arrangement of sounds, they split it apart into different words, and depending on your internal state, on the context, it then passed that whole thing into a sentence. So what happens with Sanskrit is, because sandhi or liaison happens so often, you get this ambiguity fairly often. So suppose you're wandering around in Varanasi and a pandit looks at you and says, Vriksha iha tishtati. One way, natural way that you might hear this and you might understand it is that what he's saying is, Vrikshaha iha tishtati. The tree stands here. Right? That's the way the sounds come apart. But interestingly enough, you could also completely legally and grammatically hear it as Vrikshe iha tishtati. He stands here in the tree. So, because of this continuous ambiguity in language, the people who worked in the sciences, the people who worked in philosophy and logic got really, really annoyed with this. And they invented a whole other kind of Sanskrit, which they call Shastrik Sanskrit, in which instead of saying Vriksha iha tishtati, you would say something like this. There is an agent, there is an activity which leads to a connection activity which has an agent none other than tree, etc., trying to reduce ambiguity. Right? And I'm not kidding, they wrote whole books like this. Because if you're trying to do philosophy, understanding what the other person is saying is extremely important. You can't have ambiguity. But the poets love ambiguity. Right? Poets and artists love suggestion. So the frivolous poets decided to have some fun with this. Right? So this is from a play from the 6th century. The situation here is that there is a sophisticated man about town, kind of like a rich friend from the Kama Sutra, and he's got a girlfriend, and he's done something really awful like men tend to do, and the girlfriend is really, really upset with him. So what he does is, he sends another girl, a woman, as a go-between to the girlfriend to try and persuade her that she should take him back. And so this woman goes and tells the girlfriend, as a good go-between might, not prone to anger, you're surely at your best when kind to others. Good thing to say, right? To an angry girlfriend. But as it turns out, the go-between woman doesn't really like this girlfriend. And if you take this sentence and pass it slightly differently, it can actually also mean, surely it is because you are angry and unkind that you ended up lonely and miserable. And then if you take it apart slightly differently, it can also mean, oh angry one, being godless, you are surely lonely and miserable. Or it can mean, when you are soulless and cannot help being angry, you are surely unattractive. So you can see why this would delight poets and dramatists and artists, right? Here you just don't have subtext, you have multiple text, right? The same sentence you can have saying 4 things at the same time. And so what they called this was Shlesha. And Shlesha literally means embrace, but in the poetic context, it means the poetry of simultaneous meaning.